Assalamualaikum everyone. My name is Fizan Ali Software Wala and I'm from the Ram School Islamabad campus. Today I am here with a new our today's my topic is how do maps tell stories about the past. So let's start our today's Maya. First of all, call the Maya for some questions.
Hey, hey.
So Maya, the first question from you is what is a historical map on this topic? So let's start your answer, Maya. Sorry to say my net issue. So I again recall the Maya, join the Maya, wait for a few minutes. Okay, so Maya is here with me.
Hey there. What's up?
Okay, so my first question from you is what is historical map? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
hmm Historical maps are pretty fascinating, way more than just showing where places are. Think about it. For hundreds of years before photos, if people wanted to document what they discovered or imagined about the world, they'd make a map. It's like early data visualization, but with kingdoms, sea monsters, and a whole lot of assumptions. Hold on, let me dig up some good examples. Okay, so ancient maps weren't about figuring out routes. They were shaped by what people believed about the world at the time. Think about the Babylonian world map from 600 BCE. Babylon was literally the center of everything they knew, surrounded by ocean. And medieval math had dragons in uncharted territories or showed places that didn't even exist. It's fascinating how these maps weren't purely scientific. Then you get folks like Ptolemy back in 150 AD who were really trying to be accurate with longitude and latitude lines. And a map from 1507 actually gave America its name for the first time. It's wild to think about how much of what we know now was once complete guesswork. Still with me?
Okay, so Maya, my next question from you is how are old maps different from modern maps? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
The biggest difference, modern maps prioritize accuracy above almost everything else. Well, they weren't as worried about getting it right by today's standards. They combined what explorers actually saw with legends, religious beliefs, political agendas. It was this whole mix of fact and imagination. Modern maps are built on satellites, GPS, precise surveys. Old maps were built on rumors, secondhand stories, and often just what map makers thought should be there based on their worldview. Like, ancient maps often put their own culture or nation dead center because naturally they thought they were the most important place on Earth. Modern maps aim to be objective and global. The information itself is totally different. Think continents shaped, completely wrong or non-existent as shown on older maps. That gives them totally different perspectives on the world than we have today.
That's really great. So I really appreciate your answer. So why do historians study maps and what information can maps give about the past? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
When you dig into old maps, you're basically reading history that's visually translated. They're like time capsules about how people understood or misunderstood the world. Like, studying which continents were emphasized on maps tells you a lot about the political power dynamics of that. You can see changing perceptions of ocean currents and continents that hint at advancements in their seafaring skills. Maps include also gives clues about what they value. Did they emphasize trade routes versus religious sites? Were mountain ranges seen as obstacles or opportunities? Including even map making techniques reveal clues, the materials they used, how details were illustrated, even how accurate they were. Tells you so much about technology and the prevailing scientific beliefs. So, yeah, studying maps isn't just about tracing lines on paper. It's about understanding societies and minds from completely different eras.
Okay, so that's really great, Maya. So can maps be considered historical documents? Please give me a very long answer and fully long answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
It's all right, 100% historical documents, probably more so than most people realize. Think of official records like treaties or royal decrees. Those are documents about power and decisions. But maps do both. They reflect power dynamics and they show the state of the world as people understood it at the time. They're a primary source, meaning we're looking at something that existed at that moment rather than reading someone's analysis later on. If you look at the cartography, just the techniques used, that tells you about the scientific and artistic abilities of that era. In ancient Egypt or Babylon, they carved maps onto clay tablets. That tells you what writing technologies were available, what materials they had access to, and their level of engineering. Medieval European maps show a heavy religious influence. Jerusalem might be in the center. Religious sites were often decorated and given emphasis. Later, during the Age of Exploration, maps show political ambition, who was charting what territories, which areas were being claimed by what powers. These aren't just cartographical choices. They show geopolitical motivations. Then there's what maps reveal about assumptions. Mercator projections, for example, distorted size and shape to preserve accurate angles for navigation. And while great for sailors back then, they drastically warped the perception of relative land sizes that stuck with us for centuries and had political consequences. Early maps that included mythical creatures or sea monsters, that tells you that accuracy as we define it now didn't matter nearly as much as their worldview, beliefs, or just entertaining stories. The omissions are as significant as what's included, where the trade routes, the military forts, religious settlements shown on the maps, who is or isn't shown at all. Maps can even show patterns of settlement or trade networks within that region itself. The fact that certain areas along key rivers show settlements clustered together can teach historians about economic resources, agricultural techniques, and the types of social arrangements from that specific time. Maps are literally visual narratives that weave together knowledge, perceptions, ideologies, and social structures. So, yes, they're pretty essential for anyone studying the past. That was a long one. How'd that work for you?
Okay, so Maya, my next question from you is what do maps show about how people lived long ago? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. I'm waiting for interesting and long.
Think about it. Someone had to decide what to put on a map, right? So every detail tells us something about what they considered important. Maps from old agricultural civilizations will show fields, irrigation systems, mills. That tells us what kind of farming they did, what crops they grew, and how they organized labor. Roman maps showed roads and military installations, which makes sense if your empire was built on control through infrastructure and armies. Maps showing port cities with huge harbor markings tell us about maritime economies, trade routes, what goods were being shipped. And when we look at maps of early civilizations like Mesopotamia, the presence of fortified walls shows that settlement's importance and their constant worry of attacks. Even what areas are left blank on old maps can be revealing. The parts of the world they didn't map were likely considered less significant to them. Colonial maps focused on resources they could exploit and trade routes to those resources. So copper mining sites, lumber, if not the everyday life of actual locals. Urban maps show street layouts, public spaces, neighborhoods, but also tells about wealth division, administrative centers, or cultural centers. The way rivers are shown or represented to, if they focused on river navigability versus seasonal flooding, shows very different priorities. Even seemingly random details like how they draw terrain features or show trees can tell us about cultural approaches to nature. So maps don't just show where things were, they tell us what people saw, what they valued, what they feared, pretty much a window into their entire way of life. Does that cover what you were curious about with that one?
Okay, so my next question from you is how do maps reflect trade routes and what can maps tell us about transportation in this past? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. I'm waiting for interesting answers. Let's start your answer, Maya.
Trade routes are basically written all over maps, literally. You'll see very clearly defined roads, especially the ones used for long-distance commerce. What's even cooler is seeing the infrastructure built around those routes, way stations, towns popping up along them, forts or guard posts to protect travelers and goods. Old Roman maps showed a network of well-maintained roads connecting outposts, indicating they were all part of an extensive system for supply lines, armies, and trade. Then, if you move to maps charting sea routes, like from the age of exploration, you'll spot detailed markings of popular routes with indications of favorable winds, current patterns, stopping off points, safe harbors, potential hazards. Detailed information that was critical to success. And when maps started showing port cities, it's incredibly detailed, showing docks and warehousing spaces, how big the ports actually were, what ships could navigate those waterways, which ports attracted merchants. But maps can actually tell you even more subtle things, like if inland communities were connected by navigable waterways. That tells you water transport was a really important way to move goods. Or if maps showcase dense networks of trails, but they aren't super precise routes, it hints that travel might be less organized, maybe more local and independent trade versus established empires. Road quality also matters. How carefully drawn roads are or where those roads are built will tell you how much resources and governance they had to build it. So studying what's emphasized on maps, not just where, but how it's shown, unlocks a surprising amount about the actual mechanics of getting people and goods from one place to another back then.
Okay, so Maya, my next
Make
question
sense?
from you is how are cities represented in old maps, and what do maps shows about farming or natural resources? Please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
Cities on old maps are fascinating. They're really telling us what the map makers thought made a city important. Early maps often highlighted monumental structures like castles or religious buildings because those were often the centers of power in community life. As cities grew in economic importance, you'd see more detail showing things like markets, harbor areas, or walls built around the perimeter. But you'll also see artistic choices reveal what the mapmaker considers meaningful. Sometimes it would show grand estates or manor houses, suggesting where wealth and social status concentrated. When it comes to farming and natural resources, maps definitely reflect priorities. Maps from
Okay,
empires would
so my
highlight
next question
farmland
from you
or
is how
mineral
do maps
wealth.
shows empires and kingdoms, and why are borders important in historical maps? So please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
Maps are totally political, especially when it comes to showing empires and kingdoms. Borders aren't just lines on a map, they're about controlling territory, resources, and people. Early maps representing empires usually show territory with grand displays of power. Major cities would be emphasized, administrative centers, heavily often using symbolic imagery to represent the kingdom's strength. Borders aren't actually static lines, they're shifting representations of how control actually worked, depending on who was claiming ownership. A map that shows several kingdoms side by side with clear borders might actually show a specific power structure that was more real on the map than on the ground. But you also saw deliberate fuzziness around disputed territory, right? Or maybe border zones would be left vague to show that control was constantly changing due to conflict. Maps could also exaggerate sizes of dominant kingdoms and leave smaller ones tiny to show control. Then borders could change depending on the time. One map might emphasize land empires, while another emphasize trade or religious boundaries. So in many ways, these border lines aren't just geographical features. They're about displaying who had what, who wanted what, and telling a story about political power or influence at that time.
Okay,
That would make sense?
so my next question from you is Maya. How did colonizers use maps, and can maps be used as tools of control? Please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So let's start your answer, Maya.
Definitely. Maps aren't just recording what is, they're tools that were actively used for control. Colonial powers literally used map making as a way to assert dominance by surveying, naming, and defining borders of colonized territories. By charting lands they hadn't fully explored and claiming ownership before even fully understanding local claims, they basically drew the colonial powers into existence in a legal sense. Beyond colonialism, governments have used mapping for military control. showing terrain, resources, strategic locations, identifying access routes for troops and supplies. Even local elites used maps to reinforce their power. When you have detailed maps showing property boundaries, it strengthens land ownership rules, reinforces hierarchies, and enables taxation, all forms of control. Tax maps became very important
Okay.
because it showed how
So,
much
my next
wealth
question
people.
from you is, how do maps reflect political power and how do maps reflect national cultural beliefs? Please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So, let's start.
Absolutely, maps and politics are deeply intertwined. Early maps were propaganda tools just as much as they were geographical representations. Think about medieval maps. Europe was always centrally positioned because Europeans saw themselves as the center of the world, with Jerusalem often placed as the focal point due to religious importance. The sheer size and emphasis on empires versus smaller kingdoms on the map were all about declaring what was important to focus on. Cartography isn't neutral. Even the projection style says something about political priorities. The famous Mercator projection distorts the size of land masses, but emphasizes accurate direction, reflecting colonial navies, prioritizes seafaring and exploration over preserving accurate geographical size. Then come cultural beliefs. Maps reveal how people at the time interpreted the world around them. You see that with symbolic imagery in old maps like sea monsters, mythological realms, or even angels and demons, which reflect the religious worldview. Even something like how mountains or forests are drawn shows how a culture relates to nature. Are they shown as obstacles to be conquered or as sacred places to respect? Then there's the whole thing about place names. Sometimes they reflect religious associations, legendary stories, or ethnic origins, all revealing pieces of a society's stories or cultural identity. The decision to include certain features or ignore others tells us about how people actually thought the world worked and what truly resonated with their beliefs during that specific moment in time. That was a pretty
Okay.
detailed one. Did that land the
So,
way you were hoping?
that really detailed answer. So, why are mythical creatures shown on old maps, and how did religion influence map making? So, please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So, let's start the answer, Maya.
Mythical creatures showed up on old maps for a whole mix of reasons. Some map makers literally believed in them, seeing them as real beings populating unexplored areas. Think sea serpents lurking in unknown waters or fantastical creatures inhabiting uncharted lands. It's less about deception and more about filling in gaps where actual knowledge ended. But even if they didn't truly believe in the creatures, they were using them to symbolize danger or mystery in unexplored territories. Adding mythical animals warned explorers about risk lurking on new oceans. Religion had huge influence on map making as well, particularly in European maps during the Middle Ages. Jerusalem often appeared centrally positioned, reflecting its religious importance as the center of the Christian world. Even maps featuring angels, demons, or biblical scenes showed faith and spiritual beliefs integrated into geographical representations. You would also see symbolism associated with different faith traditions. Islamic world maps might emphasize Mecca and Medina, while other faiths used religious locations to indicate holy sites and pilgrimages. So mythology and religion weren't afterthoughts to historical mapmaking. They represented the worldviews that formed those societies.
So, Maya, my
Did
next
that hit
question
what
from
you were
you
looking?
is, what languages a pair of physical, historical maps, and how do symbols help tell cultural stories? And are all maps accurate? Why or why not? So, please give me a very interesting answer on this topic. So, let's start your answer, Maya.
Historical maps used a whole range of languages depending on who made them and where they were from. Latin was a big one, especially in Europe, but then different regions spoke different languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Chinese, etc. That itself tells us something about where that knowledge or trade was actually flowing from. Symbols tell cultural stories because even basic shapes carry different meanings across different societies. Trees or forests might signify safe harbors to travelers, while rivers meant something totally different based on whether they were agricultural or religious symbols, depending on which civilization you were viewing. Mountains could signal obstacles to some civilizations or represent spirituality to other groups, and their depiction reflects that underlying worldview as well. Are all maps accurate, though? Not at all. Early maps were hugely subjective, driven by what people believed was true rather than having totally objective views based on science. Early nautical charts used estimated distance and landforms for accuracy that might have been completely off, leading sailors off course or onto shoals. Distortion from the maps themselves means that shape and size were sometimes deliberately changed or distorted in earlier maps. Even accurate maps based on scientific measurements have to be interpreted through certain lenses, such as the map projections, which are literally shapes distort reality to flatten globe onto 2D maps, which can create biases. So, yeah, maps tell us about the societies that made them more than telling us the exact physical truth. Solid stuff, or should we keep digging?
Okay, so viewers, this was our Maya. I hope you like it. I met with the new Maya next topic. Thank you.